I've received a letter from the honourable member for Greenway proposing that a definite matter of public importance be submitted to the House for discussion, namely the government's second-rate copper NBN creating a digital divide across Australia. I call upon all those honourable members who approve of the proposed discussion to rise in their places, and I call the honourable member for Greenway.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, if you were looking for your daily dose of inspiration today, you certainly would not have taken it from the Minister for Communications. On the Today Show this morning, we see Karl Stefanovic, and I quote, ask Senator Fifield to fast forward to 2020 and give his 30-second pitch to sell his great turkey to investors. And this is what he had to say. This is a national broadband network. We're the first continent to have this sort of fast broadband network. It's fit for purpose and it's over to investors. After an awkward pause, a baffled-looking Stefanovic asked, that's your pitch. You're not going to be able to sell it. Who's going to buy it? Stefanovic asked. Australians just want hard talk from their politicians. They want you to take responsibility. Well, the Minister for Communications may have no passion for this portfolio whatsoever, no vision about digital inclusion and ending the digital divide. But what is most telling, Mr Speaker, is the fact that, again, we have all blame and no responsibility on the part of this government. All blame and no responsibility. And I tell you what, Mr Deputy Speaker, you only have to look at some of the effort that this government and what we currently have under NBN Co, the effort they put into spin over improving the consumer experience. We have, for example, the Next Gen marketing campaign, how much money it has spent since January this year on that campaign alone. $9.5 million. And in contrast, Mr Deputy Speaker, how much was spent on consulting engagements for customer experience and customer service? $2.6 million. $2.6 million. Now, imagine if the amount of effort that went into spin from this government actually went into improving the consumer experience. But no, under this Prime Minister, he has thrown up his hands and said, big mess, not my problem. Big mess, not my problem. It is an extraordinary change in language from this Prime Minister to what we have seen in the past. We had him talking only days ago about how the NBN was all in hand. We had the Minister for Communications saying that the NBN under this government would be the envy of the world. We have the Prime Minister waxing lyrical about how the NBN under his tenure is the biggest corporate turnaround in Australian history. All of a sudden, the Prime Minister says, well, the NBN's a train wreck. The NBN's a train wreck. We've got it from being in hand to being in chaos. It's gone from being commercially viable to the boss of NBN Co now saying he's not even sure if it's commercially viable. Well, the question arises, Mr Deputy Speaker, what has changed? What has changed in the space of such a short time? Well, I'll let you know what hasn't changed. What hasn't changed is that the consumers of Australia are still fed up. They are fed up with the second-rate internet that they are getting under this government. Yes. The lived experience of consumers will trump any day this government blowing its own trumpet, this Prime Minister refusing to take responsibility, and absolutely nothing happening to improve and to shorten the digital divide in this country. And you have to ask yourself, Mr Deputy Speaker, you have to ask yourself, do these people opposite actually believe in making sure that we eliminate the digital divide in Australia? Because when the minister was asked about this issue, what would you think would have been a response? Maybe it would have been a response about how we recognise that Australia is part of a global economy, that we need to have the highest quality broadband in order to compete in a globalised market for goods and services and employment. And in order to do that, we need the best connectivity available for our consumers, for education, for healthcare. No, none of that. None of that. All he gives is an answer that makes even Karl Stefanovic say, "Are you serious? Are you serious?" So, Mr Deputy Speaker, this is not some abstract concept about a digital divide. We saw only a few months ago that the Australian Digital Inclusion Index shows the growing evidence around inequality and digital inclusion. And across Australia, Australians with low levels of income, education, employment are significantly less digitally included. There is a significant digital divide between richer and less well-off Australians. And again, we see in the Australian Digital Inclusion Index yet another set of benchmarks that show that this government can't even get the basics right for every Australian to have the equality of opportunity to participate in our economy, to enable Australia to compete on the world stage. Instead, they are ploughing billions of taxpayer dollars into a copper network that is simply not delivering for Australians. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, let's look at how this government has approached issues of consumers. We had the Prime Minister, for example, in response to last week's figures from the Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman, which reported a 159% increase in consumer complaints about the NBN. And what did he have to say? Well, part of it, he actually said nothing. He just gave a smirk in response to a question about this. His other answer was, well, you know, complaints, they're a fact of life. They're a fact of life. How out of touch can you get in a Prime Minister? How out of touch can you possibly get? And, Mr Deputy Speaker, they also claimed that the rollout level of complaints, is in fact in line with the rollout. It's not in line with the rollout at all. For the first time, Mr Deputy Speaker, we see consumer complaints increasing above the level of the rollout. The first time this has actually happened. And for the first time, we see NBN complaints being the highest source of complaints, that internet is the highest source of complaints in the TIO's complaints data. And what we also see, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the business case under this government, the business case for the NBN completely unravelling. The economics are changing by the day. As I said, once upon a time, not too long ago, we had the NBN supposedly being the envy of the world, all in hand. Now the head of NBN Co is calling for protections and new taxes. Saying not even sure if it's commercially viable. I'll tell you what the reality here is, Mr Deputy Speaker. Under this government, the economics of the NBN are busted, completely busted. But they throw up their hands and say, oh, not my responsibility. So not only are they busted, consumer complaints are going through the roof. This is and here is their response to what they've been doing for consumers, Mr Deputy Speaker. They say they've instituted a broadband monitoring scheme to test internet speeds. Well, I'll tell you about this, Mr Deputy Speaker. The government, the minister, sat on this advice from the ACCC for 14 months before it was actually instigated. He said earlier this year that this would be the year of the customer. That was in April this year. We're still waiting. There's still about 2 months to go to see if this is actually the year of the customer. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, what do Australians think of this government's second-rate NBN? Well, I'll tell you what they think. You only have to look at the Essential Report, where only 27% of those surveys say they support the Liberal government's plan, which actually represents an increase in support for the Labor plan since the question was asked in September 2015. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, more and more we see Australians completely turning off not only this government, but also starting to understand, and indeed many of them have understood this for some time, given the level of complaints, that this is a second-rate network that is not serving Australians. So when we talk about the digital divide, Mr Deputy Speaker, have a look at what the rest of the world thinks about us. Earlier in the year, the New York Times did a dissertation showing Australia, and I quote, "a wealthy nation with a widely envied quality of life, lags in one essential area of modern life, its internet speed." That is how the rest of the world sees us. How on earth is Australia supposed to crack the digital divide under this government, with a second-rate copper network, with a minister that has no passion and no vision, a government that won't take responsibility?
I call the Minister for Urban Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Let me make it clear that there's one thing in this debate that the Coalition takes very seriously, and that is experiences of customers on the NBN which are unsatisfactory. Where there's an unsatisfactory experience, we want to see it dealt with, we want to see it fixed. And that's why, for example, Bill Morrow, the Chief Executive of NBN Co, said last week, "We are working with retail service providers and industry as a priority to improve these figures and the overall experience for consumers. This work is being reflected in a 13.6% decline in overall TIO complaints between July to September 2017 and a 26.3% decline in TIO complaints about landline and internet services over the same period. We believe it is an early sign of movement in the right direction." So let me be absolutely clear. If there are unsatisfactory customer experiences, we want to see them dealt with, we want to see them fixed. We take them very seriously. Let me make it equally clear what we do not take seriously. We do not take seriously the attempts by the Labor Party to rewrite history and pretend that it wasn't their collection of chaotic decisions which created a starting point which we have been working to resolve. Let me remind you of some of the key Labor mistakes in relation to the NBN. The shocking process by which this model was first developed. Let me quote from an independent audit into the NBN public policy process conducted by the eminent former public servant Bill Scales AO. He had this to say about the process that led up to Kevin Rudd. Remember him announcing this approach. Quotes, "After just 11 weeks of consideration, the government had decided to establish a completely new start-up company, now called NBN Co, to roll out one of Australia's largest ever single public infrastructure projects. The NBN was to be rolled out in 8 years at a preliminary estimated cost of around $43 billion. There is no evidence that a full range of options was seriously considered. There was no business case or any cost-benefit analysis or independent studies of the policy undertaken. With no clear operating instructions provided to this completely new government business enterprise, within a legislative and regulatory framework still undefined and without any consultation with the wider community." That is what Bill Scales, an eminent former public servant, said about the train crash public policy process which led to Kevin Rudd announcing the NBN in early 2009. So that was the first mistake, the terrible process. The next mistake was appointing a board with virtually no relevant skills and management with very little relevant skills. Here's what the Forensic Accountants Court of Mentha had to say when they reported on this issue in August 2014. Their assessment of the board appointed by Labor was, quotes, "The board, quotes, had a collective lack of deep operational experience and insight in areas critical to the success of NBN Co." And I see one of the public policy geniuses on the other side of the chamber saying 5 years. That's your argument. I'll tell you what, mate, there's no statute of limitations on comprehensive public policy incompetence. When you stuff things up as fundamentally as Kevin Rudd did, that stuff up stays around for a very long time. Be it NBN, be it pink bats, be it building the education revolution, Kevin Rudd has been responsible for years and decades of public policy stuff-ups, and this government is working hard to fix them. Now, the next mistake that we saw from the Labor Party when it came to the NBN was hopelessly mismanaging the rollout. By the time we came to government, barely 50,000 premises connected to the fixed network, and they were hopelessly behind their own business case. They were supposed to be achieving 1.7 million by the 30 June 2013. In fact, they'd reached 282,799. Hopelessly behind. Now, here's another mistake, another fundamental factor that we never hear We never hear from Labor today because they wanted to erase from history, but it's a reality and you can't erase it from history. The contract that they did with Telstra was to pay $11 billion in net present value terms to Telstra and $1 billion to my former employer Optus. And yet they want to wash their hands of the fact that through these contracts they put an incoming government into a position where it had to take the most rational choice in the circumstances, and that's what we've done. The other big mistake they made was saying, we'll build fibre to the premises everywhere. We will build fibre to the premises everywhere, these geniuses said. Not one of them with a jot or iota of telecommunications operational experience, and their ripper idea was fibre to the premises to 90% of the population. Now let's look at how much fibre to the premises costs to connect to some premises. We've seen some evidence of it just in recent days. A premises in Tasmania, in Ravenswood, $91,000 to connect one premises to fibre. $40,000, Mount Cotton in Queensland. The average cost to connect fibre to the premises $4,400. The average cost to connect fibre to the node $2,200. It is for these rational business reasons, these sensible public policy reasons, that when we came to government, having inherited this hopeless train smash of a policy, we reconfigured it under the current Prime Minister, then Minister for Communications, who instituted a rational policy to turn around this mess. This turnaround is one of the most successful turnarounds you are ever going to see, and it was one of the most disastrous starting points you could possibly imagine. And why did we do it? First of all, because changing to this mix means we're going to save $30 billion. Secondly, it means that we're going to get the rollout completed 6 years earlier than would otherwise have been the case. And let's just go back to the impact of the reduced cost of the rollout just for a second. Because what we've got is one side of politics with their head in the skies, the dreamers, the visionaries. Don't talk to me about how it's done. We've got the dream. Actually, your dream is going to cost $43 a month more for the ordinary Australian family on their NBN, on their broadband bill. This is a very familiar story, members of the House. A bunch of dreamers, completely impractical, and their ripper idea means ordinary Australian families have to pay more on their bill every month. Telecommunications, energy, it's the same approach, the same incompetent public policy approach from this hopeless rabble. Let me turn to another question, which is a very instructive question for the House to consider. And that question is, what is Labor's alternative plan? What is Labor's plan? What is Labor's alternative plan? Here's a very instructive quote from the Sydney Morning Herald this morning, not notorious for its friendship for the coalition government, but here's what the Sydney Morning Herald had to say, quotes, Labor communications spokeswoman Michelle Rowland was critical of the government's handling of the project, but could not say whether in government it would spend billions more to deliver fibre to the home connections or what it would do to fix speed issues. Close quotes. There's Labor's policy. Labor communications spokesman could not say. But, you know, we can go back to 2016 and we can have a look at the policy, the ripper policy that was put forward by the member for Blaxland, who is now very relieved to have got away from this particular policy area, because this was a ripper policy. What a genius! This genius said a shortened Labor government will roll out fibre to the premises to up to 2 million additional Australian homes and businesses. That sounds great. And then listen to this next bit. Labor will spend exactly the same amount. What a miracle! The ordinary rules of economics have been abolished. They're going to find a way to build 2 million more fibre to the premises at not $1 extra. It's a miracle. It's a miracle. The conventional rules of economics have been thrown out of the window by these geniuses in the Labor Party. What did the Financial Review have to say about it? Quotes, Here we go again. Labor's announcement it will reinvigorate the NBN fibre optic cable to every home network, but not share any details or even admit that it will cost a lot more money than the current mix of technologies should come as no surprise. Labor has no credibility in this area. You could not find a better summary of this public policy area. Labor has no credibility in this area. So let's be clear. We inherited a mess. Thanks to Labor, we're fixing it up. Over 6 million premises able to connect, and we are getting on with the job. This hopeless rabble have no idea and no plan.
I call the member for Oxley.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I think it's time we took the tone down after that rant from the minister. They say the hardest word to say is sorry, and I know that word is impossible to come out of any mouth from those opposite. And the alternative universe that those inhibit, and I note this morning the Foreign Minister in the party room said to the party room that, and I'm quoting here, Julie Bishop tells the coalition room that the NBN is a success story for the coalition.
Put that on your call, please.
Mr Deputy Speaker, that is the alternative and look, I'll be honest. Sitting on this side of the chamber, you know, if that's the policy of the government, they will be the opposition very shortly, because the people of Australia are on to this government. Don't take my word for it. The member for Iron says overconfident. I'll ignore the 21 news polls that we are seeing. I'll ignore the poll after poll shows that Australians do not trust, through you, Mr Deputy Speaker, for you to handle telecommunications in this nation. So let's just deal with what the minister said, who's now vacated the floor. But if that's what the Foreign Minister is saying about NBN, I suggest she spends a little less time on the red carpet and a little more on the blue carpet, Mr Deputy Speaker, because I know by listening to what the government says, it does not match the commitments that they promised the Australian people. We've had a lot of history lessons today, and that's fine. That's the narrative from the government. We know that the Prime Minister had promised that the NBN, that every household in Australia would be connected. Every household would be connected by last year. We know that the NBN promised by the Prime Minister that the NBN would cost $29.5 billion. That was your commitment to the Australian people. His multi-technology mess now costs $50 billion, a blowout of $20 billion. Made a commitment, blows out. The Assistant Minister is shaking his head. He's saying that's not right. The Prime Minister promised everyone had access to the NBN by the end of 2016. Through you, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that correct? No answer. By the end of 2016, over 7 million premises were still waiting for connection. The Prime Minister also promised that the NBN would be faster and cheaper. The reality, he is delivering a second-rate NBN that is slower and more expensive. So we know last week the Communications Minister said the government's second-rate NBN would be the envy of the world. But all of a sudden this week, the NBN is a train wreck. So what's happened in 1 week? It went from being in hand to now being in chaos. It went from being commercially viable to the NBN CEO saying that he was no longer sure. As the Shadow Minister has said, the economics of copper are destroying the NBN. We all know it, because when we're out campaigning and we're out listening to constituents in street corner meetings, at shopping centres, when the member for Macarthur, who receives the highest amount of complaints anywhere, and those opposite I know are campaigning and doing street stalls at yacht clubs and Point Piper and country clubs, I know they don't hear the same message that those on this side of the House are hearing. We hear it day in, day out. And you know what, Mr Deputy Speaker? I know they get complaints from constituents opposite. I know so-called the minister has said that they deal with every one of those complaints. Let's talk about my electorate of Oxley, my constituent of Pam, of Cinnamon Park, who has had problem after problem since the NBN was installed in March this year. Of course, the service provider is blaming the NBN and the NBN is blaming the service provider. Still currently unresolved. Another of my constituents, Jean of Westlake, finally had her issue resolved yesterday. 7 months 7 months it took to solve a simple issue. This is what the Foreign Affairs Minister said this morning is a great success story for the coalition. The front page of my local paper, stranded. Switching to the NBN was supposed to be a godsend, but for 5 days last month, Naomi and Marcus Hodgson had no internet or phone line at all. The couple who study and run a business from their Springfield Lakes home wish they had never chosen to be connected to the NBN. Foreign Minister this morning tells the party room a complete success for the coalition. Those opposite are in an alternative universe. Just once we would like them to apologise for the mess they've created in Australia, which is their NBN.
The member's time has expired. I call the Assistant Minister for Cities and Digital Transformation.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, this government was handed a pup. And that's as far as I need to go with this analogy, but Labor's NBN was a pup, and it's those opposite who are living in an alternative universe. It's Labor, member for Oxley, that should be saying sorry on this one. Not us. It's Labor that should be saying sorry. But we haven't heard that. We haven't heard that. Now, as usual, as is customary in this place and as has been customary in recent years, we're cleaning up their mess. We have taken responsibility to fix their mess. Now, time and time again, I discover in this place that Labor doesn't show much respect for the facts and is constantly in denial. In fact, in recent times, we've seen the professional apparatchiks from the union movement turn Labor into a shadow of its former self. Rational arguments have been lost in a mist of fact-free fervour where spin merchants can create their own reality. So let's bust apart a few of those Labor myths. So false claim number one from those opposite, from the earlier speakers. False claim number one, nations around the world are rolling out fibre to the premise. Well, this is rot. Nations around the world are overwhelmingly rolling out a mix of technologies in an economically pragmatic way. Fibre to the premise might make sense in city-states like Singapore and Hong Kong, where almost the entire population lives in high-rises, but not here. Population densities of 300 people per hectare, we're about a tenth of that in our densest cities. About a tenth of that in our densest cities. Now, I know those opposite would love to turn our cities into apartment-living, basket-weaving, sandal-wearing, car-free utopias, but it isn't happening anytime soon. In the meantime, we need a range of technologies. And that's exactly what we have done in cleaning up your mess. Now, the second claim from those opposite is that under Labor's original rollout, all Australian homes would have had the NBN by 2021. More rot. Labor's fibre to the premise NBN policy would have cost, we know now, $30 billion more. That's generous, by the way. We're hearing this week about $90,000 rollout, $90,000 per premise rollouts. We read in the media it would have taken 6 to 8 years longer to complete, and it would have left millions of households waiting another decade for better broadband, including in my electorate, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, Labor drastically underestimated the time and cost involved in a full fibre rollout when they embarked on the NBN program because they didn't understand the basics of our cities and our regions, the lack of density that they thought that we had in some kind, as I explained earlier, in some kind of utopian view about what Australia should be. Now, we know that every 10 days we're rolling out more than Labor rolled out in its whole time in office. So the reality is very different from the false claims of Labor. The third false claim is that the network is behind schedule. We heard this, and that there are cost overruns. Under the coalition, NBN has hit every rollout target we've seen since coming into government. We had a 3-year rollout plan released in July 2015. We set the target of reaching half of the premises across Australia by mid-2017 and 3/4 by mid-2018, and we are right on track. In contrast, Labor In contrast, Labor forecast 1.2 million by the end of 2013. Back in December 2010, it had only passed 200,000 premises. It had burned through $6.5 billion in funding out of their total budget, and that was over $300,000 per premise. Deputy Speaker, the Labor Party sold us a pup. We have spent the last 4 years cleaning up the mess. In my electorate, we are now at a point where 89% of premises have access, and over 50% have connected, and that rate is increasing by the day. Deputy Speaker, it's time for Labor to say sorry for the mess they left.
But before I call the member for Werriwa, the volume of interjections is increasing to a point where I'm issuing a general warning. The member for Macarthur is out of his place and is grossly disordered, so he's been warned. I call the member for Werriwa.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The frustration that people are experiencing in my electorate in the growing southwest region of Sydney is clear to see. Last week's figures released in the Telecommunications Ombudsman annual report listed both Liverpool and Campbelltown as being in the top 10 postcodes for complaints. In fact, the only areas in the electorate with positive feedback are those with fibre to the premises, and they were part of the original rollout. Recently, I held an NBN forum in Werriwa. Even on a very cold night, over 100 people attended. 30 more contacted my office to provide apologies and seek further support. The forum was attended by a representative of the NBN, and I thank her for her presentation and willingness to answer questions from my constituents. But it was clear from this forum and the inquiries my office is dealing with every day that the NBN providers and retailers are failing every segment of my electorate, and this is creating a difference in the experience of our residents. Elderly residents are confused as why they need to change the phone and medical alert devices. Technicians show up but don't ensure the phones are put in the most convenient places in the house, or even that they work properly. Young people are being promised and paying for speeds which are just not being delivered. NBN Co says this is because the retailers are not buying enough bandwidth or because there's still ADSL on the line. However, the fact is they aren't getting what they were promised. My office has received in excess of 300 inquiries since June alone, when we began promoting the NBN forum. Regardless of the issues with the NBN or the telecommunication providers, the sheer scale of issues that have been raised is astonishing, ranging from issues with installation, technician appointments, the quality of installation and the speed and the reliability of connections. One of the most consistent issues raised come from constituents with hybrid fibre coaxial or HFC connections. These are used when existing pay TV or cable network users can be used, and this can be used as the final connection for the NBN. Multiple constituents who have been using an existing ADSL connection have been switched over to HFC before the connection was correctly activated, thereby leaving them without any phone or internet connection, sometimes for weeks at a time. This is particularly prevalent in Macquarie Fields and Hinchinbrook, in my electorate. When finally the connection does work, many of my constituents are so disappointed to find their service quality is in fact significantly diminished with this connection. The difficulties with switching households to HFC has been disastrous for the elderly in particular. The lack of access to a phone connection is creating a great deal of anxiety for older constituents and their families, as they frequently don't have mobile phones and don't want them and rely on their landline for cases of emergency. There is also ongoing confusion about how the NBN will interact with the special need devices, such as landlines for the hearing impaired, which the NBN Co have failed truly to clarify for many of the constituents in my electorate. Many young families moving into new neighbourhoods in my electorate are discovering that their new NBN-ready properties are not actually ready at all. In Edmondson Park, the residents of Zulu Road were very pleased to recently have their residents connected, except for the fact that they waited well over a year without any fixed-line connection. The most egregious example, however, is probably the suburb of Long Point, which I've spoken about in this place previously. Long Point residents barely have mobile coverage, and despite the NBN Co earlier promising rollout dates and connecting suburbs which are less than 60 metres away, they remain left behind. I recognise, though, that it's not just the constituents of Werriwa who've been let down by this government's bungling of the NBN rollout. Australia's average download speeds have reached 11.1 megabits per second. This leaves Australia ranked 50th in the world for average speeds, behind South Korea, behind New Zealand, Thailand and Kenya. While it's frustrating enough for someone to stream the latest Netflix series or communicate on Skype, this also risks leaving Australia behind while countries such as China and India look to keep their economies on the cutting edge and compete with the success of Silicon Valley. But this will not occur with the current NBN rollout that we've got. This has been compromised by no longer connecting home and business directly to a high-speed fibre to the network and using this second-rate copper wire.
Order.
We have seen—
The member's time has expired, and I call the member for Page.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, I start, and I'll get to the good work that we've been doing as a government with the NBN, but this whole story reminds me of an Irish joke I might share with you, Deputy Speaker. You may have already heard of it, but there's this American tourist and he's driving around Ireland and he's in his convertible, he's got the roof down, he's enjoying the Irish countryside, the stone walls, the green fields, but he's driving around. After about an hour or so he feels as though he's lost. He feels as though, I think I've driven past this place before or down this lane before. And after a while he sees an Irish farmer putting some hay into a shed, and he walks over to the Irish farm and he says, "Sir, look, I'm trying to get to Dublin." He said, "How do I get to Dublin from here?" And the Irish farmer says, "Oh, sir, if I was going to Dublin, I wouldn't start from here." And I think, Deputy Speaker, that says it all about the NBN. We were left something that isn't certainly the place you would have started from. And the Minister spoke about it, Deputy Speaker, the Minister spoke about it, and it's been well documented, the complete public policy wreck that NBN was as it was created by the Minister Stephen Conroy, and some of his exploits were well documented. But the Minister alluded to a few of them. In 11 weeks it was put together, there was no business case, there was no independent study. And let's look at this, because this was always a multi-tens of billions of dollar project, and there was no independent study ever done on it. There was no cost-benefit analysis. The board was put together, and as has been documented by independent people, that there was no operational experience on the board. No operational experience on the board, and a thing that was hatched together by a minister who did no consultation and no independent study on it. So, of course, what were we left with? We were left with the debacle that it was. And unfortunately, Deputy Speaker, I'll share a thing with you too. I often come to Canberra, when you're not in Canberra, when I'm not in Canberra and I'm with industrious Australians who are out there having a go, starting small businesses, out and about doing it, it's easy to feel optimistic about Australia and everything that's going on. When I'm in Canberra, I feel less optimistic as the week goes on, Deputy Speaker, having to listen to the ideology of those opposite, to have to listen to the diatribe that comes out of their mouth, the fact that they have no commercial experience, the fact that most of them have never run a business or have management experience. And then, of course, you hear them say things like this. So they'll say, look, if you were to run, as was originally designed by the Labor Party, that they were going to do fibre to the premise everywhere, that was obviously going to mean a couple of indefutable things. It was always going to be more expensive to build. To build a fibre to the premise model was always going to be more expensive than a fibre to the node or a fibre to the curbside. It was, besides being more expensive to build, it was always obviously going to be more expensive for the customer. To build a more expensive project meant the expense to the customer was always going to be more, and obviously the rollout was always going to be slower when you were doing a fibre to the premise model. Now, what should have happened? Well, what should have happened in the original, as it's happened in many countries, there should have been a mixture of technologies, not necessarily done by government. This is the shock to them. This didn't have to be done by government. But that's something that they just can't get through their minds, because they have to control everything. Everything needs to be built by government. Many countries have done this in a good model. They've done it with a model with private companies doing it in high traffic areas. They've done it with a model in capital cities where people compete to build it, and obviously governments got involved where it might not be commercially viable, and they do need government involvement. So that obviously is too shocking for them. Obviously everything's got to be done by government. Governments are the only people that know how to do stuff. And of course, what a great result! And it will be a thing that has gone down in history. Has gone down in history of the diabolical thing that we were left at. Much like the Irish farmer said, you wouldn't start from here, is where we were left when we took over. But look, much good has been done. The Prime Minister, who was obviously the previous member for communications, first he got in and put the management team and a governance system in place with NBN, which meant that the statistics and the rollout has been much better than it otherwise would have. In my electorate of Page, Deputy Speaker, we've had the rollout of the fixed broadband, which is now covering just about all of the electorate where the fixed broadband has been going. We're going to have a mixture of fibre to the node, but also fibre to the curbside. It's been redesigned in some of the CBDs where it's going to flood in my electorate, Deputy Speaker, so there is good work happening. Thank you.
I call a member for Fremantle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And the member for Page is spot on. The NBN, as it currently stands, it is bollockal. It is bollockal, and it's indisputable. It's indisputable. It's indisputable. It's irrefutable, and it's even, if you like, indefutable that this is 100% on you. This is 100% on you. This bollockal NBN is 100% on you. It's a rare achievement to stuff up the policy and program implementation for an essential service twice, not once, twice. It was the Howard government, in its wisdom, in its unbridled enthusiasm for privatisation, that decided to sell off Telstra, and they consigned Australia to life as a broadband backwater. That decision in the late 1990s, at the relative dawn of the internet, put us into a 20-year broadband limbo, a 20-year holding pattern. Other countries, including much less developed countries in our region, surged ahead. We have the 13th biggest economy in the world, sometimes the 12th, sometimes the 13th biggest economy in the world. We currently have broadband speeds at 53rd in the world. The member for Page tells an Irish joke. As the member for Lyons points out, in Ireland they are 7th in the world. We are 53rd in the world. It is a crying shame. Labor's creation of the National Broadband Network was designed to repair that damage, to create an affordable, consistent, high-quality broadband framework for this nation in the 21st century. And you know what? It was going to be based on fibre. It was going to be based on fibre because all the evidence and all the expertise shows that fibre is the state-of-the-art, future-proofed technology. And as every person who knows anything about broadband the world over will tell you, do it once, do it right, do it with fibre. So how did it all go wrong? Well, I think you'd be tempted to borrow a phrase from the Prime Minister and put it down to ideology and idiocy, because it's hard to explain it in any other way. It began with the lunacy of privatising an infrastructure monopoly. Privatisation at any cost is the path they wanted to go down. That's where we are now, 25 years later. It continued with the abandonment of a fibre-based network in favour of the multi-technology mess, in favour of the 19th century copper catastrophe that we live with now in 2017. Not just decades-old copper where they found it buried in the ground after 70, 80 or 90 years, but brand spanking new copper that they've bought in, becoming, I think, one of the largest copper wire stockpilers in the developed world, and shipping it around to put it back in trenches where the old copper just won't do. Why? Why did they do that? Because the Vertican Review, geniuses, cutting-edge, high-tech users like Henry Ergas, decided that the biggest risk was a fibre network might just be too fast. A fibre network might be more speed and more data than we actually needed. Never mind that since the 1970s, computing power, processing power, has doubled every single year. It's called Moore's Law. It's a law that computing power and processing power will double every year. 90% of all the data on the planet right now was created in the last 2 years. But those on that side were concerned that the fibre network would be over par, that it would be too good for Australia's need. And what is the result of all that? It means that Australian households and businesses continue to go without an essential service. It means we remain at a global disadvantage. It means our economy misses out on the most important infrastructure investment, the investment that is critical for us to take advantage of the areas that our economy needs to move into: high-tech manufacturing and agriculture, creative industries, all of the various different creative and productive opportunities that the 21st century holds, we are missing out on. And it's because of the policies of this government. The saddest thing, if you take a broad view of social and economic life, the saddest thing is the creation of a savage and steep digital divide, a divide that will lock in and exacerbate disadvantage. That will mean that the people who live in poor areas, people who already face significant disadvantage, are locked into that set of circumstances that are held out from access to health, education and essential services. The NBN disaster, it is the Prime Minister's pet project. It's his area of special interest. It was his portfolio responsibility. It is 100% on this government. They have done the double. They've sold off Telstra. They've buggered up the NBN. It is indefeatably a mess of their making, and they will wear it around their necks.
I call the member for Fisher.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Labor's attacks today are as fantastical and lacking in preparation as their plan for the NBN was in 2009. This MPI is one of the greatest own goals ever kicked. And I mean, when I read The Australian yesterday morning, I just thought surely they won't do anything on MPI in relation to the NBN. And I'm going to have great delight in going through that article. A great article it was from The Australian just yesterday. I mean, they couldn't even let the dust settle for a couple of days or a week. The best form of offence is defence, they say, and that is clearly being exhibited by those opposite today. So let's have a look at this. Now, Labor are as credible on the NBN as they are on the NDIS. Now, with the NDIS, they promised the world. They promised the world they gave us an atlas. They delivered a $55 billion funding black hole. Now, with the NBN, they told Australians that they could have and must have all fibre. They must all have fibre to the premises, whether they needed it or not. Even if they didn't want it, they still got it. What they delivered was fewer connections in 4 years than we are delivering every fortnight, and yet another black hole. Labor's impractical plan would have cost up to $84 billion, more than $30 billion more than the Coalition's business-like approach. Now, I know those opposite don't care about money, because money, we just keep putting the taxes up to pay for it. But, you know, just keep putting the taxes up. The gall of members opposite in seeking to attack the government for so effectively cleaning up your lot's mess is hard to stomach. Labor's NBN was 2 years behind schedule before it even connected a single home. A single home. Labor's NBN would have been finished, if it ever was, in 2028 and cost $3,500 for every man, woman and child in Australia. Now, Labor's NBN was spending $50,000, $80,000, even $90,000 to connect single premises to the network. And I'm going to return to that article, because that article from The Australian was just an absolute hurler, wasn't it? Now, Labor's NBN, according to one analysis, would have driven up average home internet bills by more than $500 a year. Now, Labor's plan, if you can call it that, was an impractical, financially illiterate, technologically uninformed shambles. Now, in contrast, the Coalition has taken pragmatic, business-like and evidence-based action to get Australians the high-speed broadband that they need. This government adopted a mixed technology approach, giving NBN the option to choose the best fit and most cost-effective technology solution for each area. This government saved the taxpayer $30 billion. This government fixed the build costs to ensure that the NBN's business model delivers a modest return on taxpayers' investment. This government have made the NBN available already to 6.2 million premises, and prioritised regional Australia, ensuring 2/3 of regional premises are already connected. This government got the rollout back on track, ensuring that NBN has beaten its financial year 2017 target by 100,000 and that the full rollout will be complete by 2020. In my electorate of Fisher, rollout is 53% complete. That's 45,000 households who are ready to access the high-speed broadband. Tens of thousands of people have already signed up. Though we have around 39,000 of our 85,000 premises still to connect, we're at least 6 to 8 years ahead of where we would have been under Labor's fantasy version of the NBN. Now, let's have a look at some of these costs to connect the internet. This is from the Australian yesterday, and what a great article it was. Ravenswood in Tasmania, $91,196,000. That's not to connect the town, that's just one house. Invermay in Tasmania, $86,533. Kingston in Tassie, the good place of Tassie, $55,766. Now, in relation to speed, 80% of users of NBN are opting to buy the 2 slowest NBN speed packages of up to 25 megabits per second. That's half of the average capability of 60 megabits per second, plus delivered by fibre.
And I call the member for Lyons.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, it gives me great pleasure to speak on this MPI because NBN is in Labor's blood, it's in our DNA. We created the NBN and we're incredibly proud of it. And these guys opposite, they mucked it up, they messed it up, they've killed it. Now, just a couple of issues I'd like to go through before I get to the substance of my speech. And the member for Page, who's unfortunately no longer with us, he says, oh, the NBN, it didn't have to be delivered by government. Well, for a member who represents the far north-east of New South Wales, I can't imagine any corporation or any telecommunications company breaking their neck to deliver NBN services to the good constituents of Page. So he might want to have a talk to his constituents about that. My good friend, the member for Fisher, scoffing at the cost of service delivery for cherry-picked premises. I wonder if those opposite, especially National Party members, have the same attitude and put the same logic to extending services like roads and power lines and power poles and telephone wires to remote and rural areas of this country. Yeah, they cost more per premises to deliver as well, and they too, like the NBN, are essential services. So 2 issues there. Now, Tasmanians know about the digital divide. We live with it every day. The Australian Digital Inclusion Index, which the Shadow Minister referred to, shows that Tasmania still lags in the broadband stakes. Southern Tasmania, which includes part of my electorate, is in the bottom 5 digitally included regions in Australia. In 2014, Tasmania's digital inclusion score was 4.5 points behind Victoria, now at 7.7. For digital ability, in 2015 there was a 5.8 point difference, and now it's 8.6. The affordability gap has blown out from 1 point in 2015 to 7.9 points now. It's going in the wrong direction under this government. Ever since the election of the Liberal government, Tasmania's digital gap has widened. What a different story it was under Labor, when Tasmanian towns and cities were the first in the country to benefit from Labor's real NBN, with fibre to the premises delivered in Sorrel, Midway Point, Smithton and Scottsdale, Launceston and Hobart. And these places are now the envy of the country, delivering super-fast broadband. We've got Launceston, the first gigabit city in the country. One can only imagine how bad the digital divide in Tasmania would have been if Labor had not delivered fibre to the premises. Now, the Prime Minister says that Australia should have followed the New Zealand example, he's quoted in the press, of splitting an existing telecommunications company into wholesale and retail rather than creating the NBN. He conveniently forgets that his side privatised Telstra, as my friend the member for Fremantle mentioned. His side privatised Telstra and refused to include separation when it did so. And those opposite, including the Prime Minister before he became the Prime Minister, opposed Labor's legislation at the time for separation. So he says Labor should have followed the New Zealand example, but he was one of the very people who prevented it from happening. The NBN, it didn't exist before 2009. It was conceived, it was developed, and it was started under Labor, and it was starting to roll out. in just 4 years. A mammoth infrastructure project that is, I mean, the size of it is almost can't be conceived, and it was rolling out in 4 years. And it was well underway when those opposite came to power and they demolished it. Who can forget? Who can forget that cringeworthy performance by the Prime Minister when he was Shadow Communications Minister with the former opposition leader Tony Abbott, member for Warringah, when you know, the man who invented the internet, and they said that they were going to crush the NBN and create their version of it. A cringeworthy performance. That was the beginning of the end for the NBN in this country and under this Prime Minister, and he's kept that up. He's been an absolute disgrace as a Prime Minister, the worst communications minister in this country. He had one job to deliver an NBN that this country could be proud of, and he's wrecked it. As Prime Minister, he's had the power and the authority to deliver an NBN that Australians can be proud of, that can close the digital divide in this country, but instead he's widened it, he's made it worse. He's delivered an NBN that no one is proud of, where complaints are soaring, that nobody wants to be part of, that he's so embarrassed about, he doesn't want to answer questions in this place and defers to his junior minister. It is an absolute disgrace, and I back the Shadow Minister in this MPI. Only Labor can deliver a real NBN.
Time has expired. I call the member for Swan.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. We just heard from the member for Lyons, and he said when we took over as government in 2013, the NBN was well underway. But I'll just be happy to remind him of how well it was underway during part of my speech. Now, we also heard the member for Fisher talk about an own goal, and it reminded me of a question from the Leader of the Opposition back on September the 14th, when I managed to send a gift to one of the opposite members. I won't name who it was, but sent a gift to one of the opposite members of a bloke playing soccer who actually tries to kick the ball over his head, but he actually kicks it into his head and it goes into the goal. And that reminds me of this MPI. It's an own goal. And this has been going on since 2010, Mr Deputy Speaker, these MPIs on NBN. And there's a lot of new members here, but I see the member for Hunter. He'll know. He's probably participated in a few MPIs on the NBN over the years. But back in 2015, just before some of the members who are now in here weren't here, there was a question I gave to the previous the Minister for Urban Infrastructure, who at that time was the Minister for Territories, Local Government and Major Projects. He certainly wasn't the Minister for the Asian Century. I don't know whether he's gone now, but I know there was one back when the Labor were in power. They've all disappeared, those ministers. But so my question, Mr Speaker, to the Minister at the time was that I've received letters from constituents about the poor broadband service in the Ascot Exchange since I got elected. In 2007, the then Labor member wrote to the constituents of Swan and said they would solve this issue. They would solve it by 2009. They said they would fix it, but in 6 years they did nothing. They were absolutely useless. What action is the coalition government taking to reverse Labor's inaction and pathetic uselessness and to help my constituents in the Ascot Exchange? So, with a lot of interjections, because the members, a few of the members over there, and particularly the Manager of Opposition Business, said there was argument within that particular question, but the Speaker allowed it, and this was the Minister's answer in regards to, and I remind the member for Lyons to listen to how well underway they were in Western Australia, and this will tell you how well underway after 5 years of rolling out the NBN they were in Western Australia. And Mr Fletcher at the time, he goes on to say to thank the member for his question, which really reflects a campaign that he has been assiduously pursuing in the totality of his time here in Parliament in relation to delivery of broadband in Ascot. There is, as the member informed the House, a letter on record from Kim Wilkie MP, the then Labor member for Swan from 2007, which says Labor's national broadband network will solve Ascot's broadband problems. There it was. There was the promise in 2007. And so when the new member for Swan, as he was in 2007, came to the Parliament, he understandably pursued the delivery of that promise through the Labor government. What happened? Nothing. To his great surprise, when the City of Belmont and Eastern Metropolitan Regional Council put forward a proposal to prioritise the Ascot Exchange, it was rejected by the then Minister for Broadband, Senator Conroy. He rejected out of hand the proposal when there had been a promise only 2 years before by the then Labor member for Swan that Ascot would be sorted out. as it has fallen, as it always does, to the Coalition to sort out Labor's mess. We are doing that with the NBN all around Australia. We are doing that in the electorate of Swan, where there are 28,000 premises ready for service today. And I'm sure there are many in the House who recollect the total number of premises connected in all of Western Australia in 2013, wait for it, in 2013, when we came to government, was 34. 34 premises in the whole of Western Australia after 5 years. And the member for Lyons says it was well underway. It was well underway after 5 years. What an absolute disgrace. And you know how many were in Swan? 18. 18 connected. 18 connected. Yet today, only slightly more than 2 years later, in just one electorate in West Australia, over 28,000 premises are ready for service. Indeed, when we came to government, West Australian NBN rollout was in such a disarray that the primary contractor, Synthio, this is another contract by the Labor government. Synthio, remember that contractor you guys picked and selected to roll out the NBN? Well, where were they? They pulled out of the market. So we have turned that situation around in a short period of time, thanks to the advocacy of the member for Swan on behalf of his constituents. Some 15,500 homes and businesses in Ascot, Belmont, Cloverdale, Perth, Redcliffe and Rivervale will see the construction begin in the first quarter of 2017. Now, to update the member for Lyons as well, we actually have connected now over 59,000 premises in Swan. 59,000 premises, and we're 83%. No, they're working well, mate. They're working well. I've actually been out on the site. The NBN is being rolled out by the coalition government and successful, particularly in my electorate of Swan.
Order. The time for the discussion has concluded. I call the clerk.